Time isn't what it seems. It never was. And for Jaleesa, time has never felt more wrong. She should be recovering, adjusting to life with her newborn Tories, savoring these quiet moments, feeling comfort in the familiar. But nothing feels right. Clocks don't match her memories. Her routine is slipping through her fingers. And then there's Zoe, her sweet, talkative 5 year old, who looks up at her and asks, Mom, don't you remember? Travis, her husband, tries to keep her grounded. Quinn, her sharp but nosy employee, senses something is off. But no one sees what Jaleesa sees. No one feels the pull of something shifting until one morning she wakes up late. The bakery is waiting, her family is waiting, but time is no longer waiting for her. What happens when time turns against you? When the moments you trust the most start lying to you? Welcome to Paradox Vault, where reality bends and time refuses to stay still. Jaleesa's body trembled as she lay on the hospital bed. The sterile scent thick in the air, her gown clinging to her damp skin. A sharp contraction rippled through her, forcing her to grip the sheets. She had been here for hours, how many she wasn't sure. The fluorescent lights overhead blurred, and the rhythmic beep of the fetal monitor was a constant reminder that time was slipping past her, though she wasn't sure how much had passed, or if it was moving at all. Travis's voice broke through the fog, low and soothing as he wiped sweat from her forehead. You got this, baby, he murmured. But she could see the fear flickering behind his eyes, the worry buried beneath his reassurances. She opened her mouth to respond, but another contraction hit, stealing her breath, crushing any words before they could form. The doctor's voice came through the haze, clipped and focused. Jaleesa, we need to move quickly. The baby's heart rate is dropping. Something cold slithered down her spine. No, no, I can push, she gasped, shaking her head. But the room was already shifting around her, nurses moving in, prepping her. A sudden suffocating panic took hold. She wasn't ready. The walls seemed too bright, the voices around her too sharp, the weight in her chest pressing down like an unseen force. She couldn't do this. Travis squeezed her hand. It's okay, baby. I'm right here. The words should have anchored her, but they didn't. Because in that moment, something was wrong. Not with the doctors, not with the baby, with time. She blinked, and suddenly she wasn't in the delivery room anymore. She was somewhere else. The monitors were silent. The fluorescent lights flickered like a dying bulb. The walls looked the same, but something was off, warped, stretched, unnatural. And the clock on the wall wasn't ticking. It wasn't moving. The second hand twitched, stuck at the same mark as if frozen mid-mation. A scream built in her throat, but before it could escape, the room lurched, and suddenly she was back in the bright, sterile hospital, the sound of her heartbeat slamming against her eardrums. Jaleesa, we need to start now. She gasped, her mind reeling. Had she just blacked out? The doctors didn't seem to notice anything strange. Travis was still there, gripping her hand, but her body was cold, as if for a moment she had been somewhere else. The mask was lowered over her face. Her breath came in ragged bursts. I, she started, but her voice was swallowed by the rising beep of machines. Then, darkness, a void, and the whisper of something that wasn't human. Tick, tick. She woke up hours later, but something told her time hadn't moved forward at all. Elisa's consciousness floated between the depths of sleep and the edge of wakefulness, her mind sluggish, like she was wading through thick water. A rhythmic beep echoed through the room, steady and unchanging, yet something about it felt wrong. The scent of antiseptic clung to the air, sharp and clinical, a stark contrast to the warmth she vaguely remembered before this. Before what? Her thoughts felt scattered, fragmented, slipping from her grasp before she could make sense of them. Her body felt heavy, her limbs unresponsive at first. Slowly, she became aware of the dull, aching pressure in her abdomen, deep, pulsing, and strangely distant, like it belonged to someone else. The realization hit sluggishly. The baby. She had been pregnant. She had the baby, right? Her mind grasped at the details, but everything fell off kilter, disjointed like pieces of a puzzle that didn't quite fit. A soft drip from an IV bag, the faint hum of medical equipment. The walls, a shade of muted blue, seemed too bright under the fluorescent lights. Her breath came slow, uneven. Something about the air in the room felt thick, like it was pressing down on her. She swallowed, her throat dry and scratchy, an odd taste lingering on her tongue. Metallic, almost like blood. Her eyelids were too heavy, resisting her attempts to lift them. Then a shadow moved nearby. It was a subtle shift, like the air bending around an unseen figure, making her pulse quicken despite the lethargy weighing her down. She tried to focus, but her vision blurred, a strange static-like sensation buzzing at the edges of her mind. For a brief moment, she thought she heard whispering, faint, like wind slipping through a crack in the wall. Then, just as she tried to place it, the whisper stopped, as if it had never been there at all. A shiver crawled along her spine, a deep instinct warning her that something wasn't right. A sharp click sounded in the room like a switch flipping, but nothing changed. The beeping of the monitor momentarily stopped, a single second of unnatural silence, then resumed as if nothing had happened. Had she imagined it? She blinked, forcing her eyes open. The room seemed stretched, as if the corners weren't quite meeting where they should. It was subtle but wrong, a warping of reality that made her stomach twist. She turned her head slowly, her vision sharpening. A nurse stood at the edge of the room, adjusting something on a rolling cart. Jaleesa frowned. Had she been there before? The woman's back was turned, but there was something strange about her stillness, too rigid, too unnatural. The air felt thick again, charged, like the moment before a thunderstorm. Jaleesa swallowed, trying to push down the unease. Finally, the nurse moved, turning toward her. Jaleesa's breath caught. The woman's face was normal, too normal. Her smile stretched a little too perfectly, her eyes a little too wide. "You're awake," she said in a voice that was soft but wrong, a fraction of a second too delayed, like a recording played just off sync. Jaleesa's fingers curled into the blanket. "Yes," she croaked, barely recognizing the rasp of her own voice. The nurse just stood there, watching. Then, without another word, she turned and walked out of the room, her footsteps too light, almost soundless. Elisa exhaled, trying to slow her pulse. Maybe it was the drugs. Maybe she was just exhausted. Her gaze shifted toward the clock on the wall. The second hand ticked forward, forward, then stopped. A sharp beat of silence. Jaleesa's breath hitched, her pulse skipping with the unnatural stillness. Then a single deliberate tick backward. A sharp wave of dizziness slammed into her. She blinked hard, and suddenly the clock was normal again, moving forward as if nothing had happened. Her breathing was shallow now. Had she imagined that? She had to have imagined that. Her fingers twitched, itching to reach for the call button, but she hesitated. What would she even say? The door creaked open. This time, it wasn't the nurse. Travis. Relief washed over her, but it was laced with something else: disorientation. She knew him, of course, but for half a second his face looked unfamiliar, like a photograph of someone she should know but couldn't quite place. Then, just as fast as it came, the sensation faded. He smiled, tired but warm. You scared me, he murmured, sinking into the chair beside her. His fingers brushed over her hand, grounding her. You were out longer than they said you'd be. Elisa blinked, her mind sluggishly trying to piece things together. How long? Her voice felt small, foreign. Travis hesitated just for a second, but she caught it. A while, he said vaguely. Something in her stomach twisted. How long? She pressed, forcing strength into her tone. Travis exhaled through his nose, rubbing a hand over his face. A sharp chill crawled through her veins. That wasn't right. She had just been on the table, hadn't she? Panic curled in her chest. That doesn't make sense, she whispered. Travis squeezed her hand. Jaleesa, you lost a lot of blood. They had to put you under longer than expected. Everything is fine now. The baby is fine. His voice was gentle, reassuring, but something about it felt rehearsed. Jaleesa swallowed, her throat suddenly dry again. Where is she? Travis turned, motioning toward the bassinet by the window, and there she was, Tori, tiny, perfect, swaddled in a pink blanket. A wave of emotion crashed over Jaleesa, overpowering the unease for a moment. She tried to sit up, wincing as pain lanced through her abdomen. Travis was already reaching for her, helping her adjust. Take it slow, he murmured. She barely heard him, her focus locked on the baby. But as she stared, something gnawed at the edges of her mind. Something wasn't right, a feeling distant but insistent, a memory she couldn't grasp. She had been here before, not just in this hospital, but this moment. An unsettling deja vu crept over her skin. Zoe's words flashed in her mind. Mommy, you already woke up before. Her fingers curled against the sheets. The room felt too quiet now. The fluorescent light flickered just once. Jaleesa's breath came slow and shallow as her gaze drifted back toward the clock. Her stomach dropped. The second hand wasn't moving at all. Then, without warning, it lurched forward, four ticks in rapid succession, as if catching up. A wave of nausea rolled through her. The air itself seemed to hum, vibrating with an invisible frequency. She squeezed her eyes shut, willing the dizziness away. When she opened them again, everything was normal. Travis was still there. Tori still slept peacefully. The beeping of the monitor was steady. The clock was ticking. Zelisa let out a slow breath, but the unease remained, buried deep. Something was wrong, and she was going to find out what it was. Delisa stirred against the hum of the car engine, her body still heavy with exhaustion. The world outside moved in slow, rhythmic streaks of color. Gray roads, bare trees, the washed out sky. Her mind felt stretched, as if caught between two places at once: the hospital, the car, home. A dull throb pulsed in her temples. Travis sat beside her, one hand gripping the steering wheel, the other tapping absently against his knee. His face was calm, but she caught the quick glances he kept throwing her way. The baby seat in the back held Tori, swaddled and still. The sight should have comforted her, but instead an uneasy weight settled in her stomach. She blinked and caught something flicker in the side mirror. A shape, a person, but before she could focus, the image was gone. Her chest tightened. The road felt endless, stretching unnaturally. Wasn't their house closer? A dull ringing filled her ears. The car slowed. Travis pulled into the driveway, shifting into park. The motion jolted her, snapping the world into place. Jaleesa exhaled, but the unease remained. The house felt too quiet when they stepped inside. The air was thick, heavy with the faint scent of vanilla candles, and something more familiar: home. Yet something about it felt wrong, as if the walls leaned in slightly, pressing too close. Granny E stood by the kitchen, arms crossed, watching. Zoe rushed forward, her small hands reaching for Jaleesa's. She held up a bright pink watch, its digital numbers blinking. Jaleesa's stomach twisted. A watch? She hesitated. The weight in her chest deepened. Something felt off. The way the air sat, the silence that pressed around her. She reached for the words, but found only static in her mind. The walls of the house seemed too still, too expectant, as if waiting for something to break the moment. A sense of deja vu crawled along her skin, whispering that she had stood in this exact spot before. Jaleesa forced herself to move, her limbs slow, her breath uneven. The weight of exhaustion dragged at her, pulling her toward the couch. She wasn't sure if she sat down or if the world simply tilted around her. The cushions beneath her felt strange, as if she were sinking deeper than she should. The house still carried the warmth of life, of people moving around her, but beneath it was something else, something just beneath the surface. Jaleesa's gaze drifted, unfocused, to where Zoe sat beside her, cradling the watch in her small hands. The numbers blinked. 12 o'clock. Over and over, refusing to change. Her mind stumbled over the sight. The numbers should shift. The time should move forward. But it remained frozen in place. A whisper of unease curled through her. She wet her lips, her throat dry, her voice barely carried. The watch wasn't broken, Zoe had said, so why wouldn't the numbers change? A thick drowsiness pressed at her skull, pulling at the edges of her mind. Her limbs felt weighted, her breath slowing. The moment stretched, suspended in something unseen, and just as sleep took hold, she heard it. A sound so faint it might have been imagined. A distant, deliberate tick. Her breath caught, then, pop. The sound didn't come from Zoe's watch. It came from inside the walls. Jaleesa's breath came shallow, her heartbeat drumming in her ears. The hallway outside her door stretched in darkness, the faintest sliver of light from the nightlight in Zoe's room barely reaching the edge of the carpet. The silence pressed in, thick and unmoving. She clenched the baby monitor tighter in her hand, the plastic cool against her palm. The screen flickered again, static distorting the image of Tori's crib. Jaleesa's stomach twisted. She should get up, check the nursery, prove to herself that the monitor was just glitching. But her limbs felt cemented in place, her body unwilling to move. Another creak echoed through the hallway, closer this time. She swallowed against the tightness in her throat and forced herself to move. Swinging her legs off the bed, she winced as her feet met the cool floor. Each step felt heavier than the last as she made her way toward the doorway. The air felt thicker here, as if the house itself was holding its breath. She reached the nursery, her fingers trembling as she turned the knob. Tori lay exactly where she should be, her tiny chest rising and falling in steady rhythm. Relief crashed over Halisa so hard it nearly buckled her knees. She was there. She was okay, but the feeling was short-lived. Something was wrong. The air in the room was colder than the rest of the house, carrying a faint metallic scent. Jaleesa's skin prickled, her instincts screaming that she was not alone. She took a slow step forward, scanning the room. The rocking chair by the window sat eerily still, untouched. The closet door stood slightly ajar, just a crack, but enough to make her pulse spike. She didn't remember leaving it open. Her fingers hovered over the crib railing as she listened. The monitor in her hand buzzed faintly, and then tick, tock. Her fingers trembled as she reached for the closet door. It wasn't fear that stopped her, it was something worse, something ancient, instinctive. Every nerve in her body screamed, "Don't open it." A breath of cold air leaked from the crack, curling around her wrist. She hesitated. Then, from the baby monitor still clutched in her other hand, a whisper, a voice, faint, garbled. "Mommy?" Her breath caught. The sound was small, delicate, but Tori was too young to speak. A sharp chill rushed through her veins, and before she could stop herself, she yanked the closet door open. The light from the nursery spilled in, cutting into the darkness. The space was empty. No toys out of place, no clutter on the floor, nothing hiding in the shadows. And yet the cold remained, clinging to her skin. Halisa let out a slow breath, her chest tightening. Maybe she was losing it. The exhaustion, the stress. It was making her see, no, she wasn't imagining this. Something was here, watching, waiting. She turned back to the crib, and her stomach lurched. The blankets were slightly shifted, not enough for Tori to have moved on her own, just enough for something to have touched them. Jaleesa's pulse thundered in her ears as she stared at the crib. The blankets had shifted, just barely, but enough to send ice through her veins. She swallowed hard, trying to steady her breathing. She had to be imagining it. The exhaustion, the stress, the whispers of paranoia curling at the edges of her mind. Her fingers twitched at her side, itching to reach out to smooth the fabric back into place, but her body refused to move. A deep, unsettling awareness prickled at her spine, telling her something was wrong. The cold still clung to the air, a presence that didn't belong. The silence around her was too thick, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. Then, from the baby monitor in her hand, a noise, a slow, dragging shuffle. The sound was distant yet suffocating, a weight pressing into her chest. Her gaze snapped back to the screen. The grainy image of the nursery flickered, lines of static warping the edges. The crib came back into focus, but something was different. The blankets weren't just shifted now, they were lower, as if someone had peeled them back. Her breath caught. Tori hadn't moved. She couldn't have. A sharp sting of fear gripped Jaleesa's chest. Then the sound came again, this time louder, closer. A soft exhale, not hers. not the babies. Her stomach twisted. She turned sharply, scanning the room, her pulse hammering against her ribs. The closet was still open, its shadows deep and unmoving. The rocking chair by the window sat eerily still, but something had changed. She could feel it. The air felt charged, electric, waiting. She forced herself to step closer to the crib, her knees unsteady. Her fingers hovered over the railing, the baby monitor buzzing faintly against her palm. A voice, soft as a breath, crackled through the static. A single word, Mommy. Jaleesa's blood turned to ice. The walls of the nursery seemed to pulse as Jaleesa staggered back. Her vision swam, the air thickening around her like fog. The crib, the rocking chair, the doorway, everything blurred at the edges, shifting, twisting, as if time itself was bending. Her heartbeat slammed in her chest. She pressed a hand to her temple, willing the dizziness to pass, but it only grew worse. She took a breath, then another. It wasn't real, none of it. The whispers, the ticking, the shifting shadows in the corners of her vision. She just needed to get out of this room, clear her head, shake this feeling. But her legs wouldn't move. Her feet felt glued to the floor, like the house itself had tightened its grip on her. The baby monitor crackled in her hand. A sharp burst of static, followed by something worse. A sound so faint, so unnatural, it sent ice curling down her spine. It was a breath, a slow, measured breath. Not Tori's, not hers. A breath that didn't belong. Delisa squeezed her eyes shut. You're imagining it. That's all this was. The exhaustion, the stress, the blurred line between waking and dreaming. When she opened them again, the room was still. The crib empty. The closet door closed. The air silent. Normal. But the ground beneath her wasn't steady anymore. It tilted just slightly. A slow, almost imperceptible shift. The walls stretched, the shadows lengthened. She blinked hard, but the distortion remained, like a cruel trick of her mind. A wave of nausea rolled over her. The dizziness wasn't stopping. Jaleesa stood frozen, the silence pressing in around her like a thick fog. The baby monitor in her hand was dead, no static, no flickering, just a blank screen reflecting her own hollow stare. The weight in her chest deepened. She had been here before, not just in the nursery, not just in this moment, but somewhere deeper. A memory, a dream. The sensation clawed at the edges of her mind, demanding to be acknowledged. But the harder she reached for it, the further it slipped away. She turned toward the hallway, her vision swimming. The house was too still, no hum of the heater, no distant sound of the wind. Even the floor beneath her feet felt wrong, as if it wasn't really there. Had it always been this quiet? A chill curled around her spine. Her feet carried her forward, slow, hesitant. The hallway felt longer, too long. The walls stretched at the edges of her vision, distorting like a reflection in rippling water. Each step echoed, but the sound was delayed, just slightly, a fraction of a second too late, as if time itself was struggling to keep up. She stopped. Was someone breathing? The sound was faint, nearly swallowed by the silence, but it was there. Not her own, not steady, a slow, quiet inhale. Then nothing. Her pulse hammered in her throat. She forced herself to turn her head toward Zoe's room, the door slightly ajar, darkness pressing against the edges. The sound was coming from inside. Jaleesa swallowed hard, her throat dry. Her mind screamed, "Don't go in!" But her body moved anyway, drawn forward by something unseen, something pulling her toward the void beyond the doorway. The air thickened as she reached out, fingers trembling as they touched the cold wood of the door. It creaked as it swung open, revealing a room that was not Zoe's. Her breath hitched. This wasn't right. The furniture was wrong. The bed, the shelves, the walls, all empty. Stripped of color, stripped of warmth. No toys, no books, no signs that a child had ever lived here. The room looked like it had been abandoned for years. But that wasn't possible. She had just tucked Zoe in earlier that night. She had just kissed her forehead. Had she? The air buzzed. A high-pitched ringing built in her ears, growing louder, sharper. Her legs wobbled, knees nearly giving out as dizziness crashed over her. The room tilted, not in a way she could rationalize, but in a way that made her feel like she was being pulled through time itself. The walls flickered, bending in and out of focus. And then the voice, soft, right behind her. "Mommy?" Jaleesa's breath caught, her body locking in place. Her mind screamed at her to turn around, to run, to wake up, to do something, but she couldn't move. The air around her felt electric, charged with something unseen. The room flickered again. Zoe's bed appeared for a split second, her stuffed animals in place, the posters on the wall exactly where they should be. But then it was gone. A whisper brushed against her ear. "You forgot me." The floor buckled beneath her. Jaleesa staggered backward, crashing into the door frame. The room snapped back to normal in an instant. Zoe's bed was there. The shelves were filled. The walls were pink again. But Zoe was gone. Jaleesa's chest rose and fell in sharp, uneven breaths. Her mind reeled. She turned, scanning the hallway, the nursery, the darkness beyond. Where was her family? Had they ever been here at all? Jaleesa's eyes snapped open. She wasn't in the office. She wasn't at work. She was home, in bed. Her chest rose and fell in sharp, uneven breaths as she stared at the ceiling, the morning light filtering through the blinds. A slow, suffocating sense of deja vu wrapped around her like a tight sheet. Hadn't she already been awake? Hadn't she already left for work? She rolled over, grabbing her phone from the nightstand. 7:42 a.m. Her stomach dropped. She was supposed to be at the bakery 40 minutes ago. Her body moved before her mind could catch up. She threw the blankets off, nearly tripping over herself as she stumbled to the bathroom. The cold tile sent a jolt up her spine. Why hadn't her alarm gone off? Had she even set one? She grabbed her toothbrush, barely registering the reflection staring back at her. She looked different. Her skin was pale, her eyes hollow, like she hadn't slept in days. Maybe she hadn't. Maybe time had been slipping through her fingers without her even noticing. She spit out the toothpaste, barely rinsing before rushing to get dressed. Everything felt slow. Her hands moved, pulling on clothes, slipping into shoes. but the world around her felt a step behind. She grabbed her keys and rushed out the door, the cold air biting at her skin. The drive was a blur. She wasn't even sure how she got to the bakery, but suddenly, she was there. She slammed the car door shut, still breathless, and rushed inside. The second the door chimed, Quinn's voice greeted her. Well, 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 Jaleesa winced. Look who finally decided to show up. She turned to see Quinn leaning against the counter, arms crossed, a smirk tugging at his lips. He didn't look bothered. He didn't even look surprised. If anything, he looked amused. She pushed her hair back, swallowing hard. I overslept. Quinn raised an eyebrow. Is that what we're calling it? Jaleesa frowned. What's that supposed to mean? He shrugged, tapping the register with one finger. I just think it's funny. You being late again. Her head throbbed. I wasn't late yesterday. Quinn's smirk widened, but his eyes stayed sharp. If you say so. She opened her mouth to argue, but hesitated. Had she been late yesterday? A sick feeling twisted in her gut. Quinn pulled a tray of fresh croissants from the oven, his movement smooth practice, like he had been doing this without her for weeks. It's all good, boss, he said. I got everything handled like I always do. He shot her a glance. You know, in case you forget. Her fingers curled into fists. She didn't like the way he said that, didn't like the way he was looking at her. The register beeped, snapping her out of it. A customer stepped forward, holding a receipt. I placed an order for pickup yesterday, the woman said. But there's a problem. Jaleesa swallowed. Yesterday? Quinn's smirk didn't fade. Jaleesa forced herself to step behind the counter. She wasn't sure if her hands were shaking from being late or because Quinn's words were still hanging in the air, like he knew something she didn't. Jaleesa stared at the crinkled receipt in the customer's hand, her pulse thudding in her ears. She tapped the register screen, fingers unsteady. What's the issue? The woman sighed, tapping the paper. I picked this up yesterday, but the system still shows it as unclaimed. Jaleesa's stomach tightened. She glanced at the order number, 5934, the same number from earlier. Something in her brain lurched. Hadn't she already solved this? Hadn't she already had this conversation? Behind her, Quinn let out a low chuckle. That's weird, huh? Jaleesa's breath caught in her throat. She turned to him, searching his face, but he was already grabbing a tray of muffins like none of this mattered. You got this, boss, he added, unless you need me to fix it again. The words landed wrong, too pointed, too aware. Jaleesa turned back to the register. The screen blinked, momentarily distorted, numbers flashing too fast to read. She blinked, and the screen was normal again. Her chest tightened. She typed in the order number manually. 5934. It popped up, unclaimed. That wasn't right. Quinn had already fixed this. She had already watched him fix it. But now it was back like nothing had changed. Her hands trembled as she tried to adjust the status, but the button wouldn't press. Her finger hovered over the screen, but it was like it wasn't real. She swallowed hard and turned back to the woman. Let me check something real quick. The woman sighed but nodded. Jaleesa barely noticed. She was already stepping away from the counter, heart hammering as she made her way toward the office. Quinn didn't stop her, but she felt his eyes on her the entire way. The moment she stepped inside, the air felt different, thick, like the walls were pressing in. The small office was dimly lit, the scent of old coffee lingering. The security monitor sat idle on the desk. Her breath came faster. She had to check. She had to see it for herself. Jaleesa's hands trembled as she clicked the mouse, pulling up the security feed. The screen flickered, black lines distorting the image for a second before settling. The front counter came into view. She scrubbed back through the footage, fingers tight on the mouse. The timestamp read 7:42 a.m. Her stomach twisted. That was when she walked in this morning. She hit play. The door chimed. She saw herself enter, looking dazed, hesitant. Quinn turned, smirking, his lips moving. The customer stepped up with her receipt. Jaleesa leaned in closer, her breath shallow. She had already watched this moment happen in real life. But something was wrong. The register screen on the footage blinked, the order number flashing rapidly. The timestamp froze. A heavy silence settled in her chest. She tried to fast forward. The screen glitched. A jarring static rippled through the image, distorting Quinn's face. His eyes snapped toward the camera. Jaleesa's heart lurched. He was staring at her. Right through the screen, his mouth moved, forming words, but there was no sound. Her pulse pounded. She turned up the volume. Nothing. But his lips kept moving, over and over, like a warning, like a message. She tried to rewind, but the footage jumped forward instead. The screen flickered. The bakery was empty. She was gone. Her breath caught in her throat. She dragged the timeline backward, fingers shaking. But no matter how far back she went, she wasn't there. She never walked in. She never stood at the counter. The register was untouched. The security feed showed Quinn running the place alone, just like yesterday. Jaleesa pushed back from the desk, her chair scraping against the floor. No, this wasn't right. The clock on the wall hadn't moved. The hands were frozen at 7:42 a.m. A sharp knock on the office door made her jump. She gasped, spinning around. Quinn stood in the doorway, watching, his face calm, his smirk slight, but his eyes were sharp, knowing. Jaleesa's pulse thundered. What? Her voice cracked. She swallowed hard, trying to steady it. What do you want? Quinn exhaled, stepping inside just enough to lean against the door frame. You tell me, he said, voice smooth. His gaze flicked toward the security screen, still frozen on the empty bakery. Find what you were looking for? Jaleesa's throat tightened. This footage is wrong, she whispered. Quinn's smirk didn't fade. Is it? His voice was almost amused. He glanced at the clock, still stuck at 7:42 a.m. You ever feel like time's just running in circles? The lights flickered, the air thickened. Jaleesa's vision swam. Jaleesa's breath came shallow and uneven. The air felt heavier now, thick with something unspoken. Her fingers curled against the armrests, her nails pressing into the fabric. What are you talking about, Quinn? Her voice was softer than she intended, like a whisper she wasn't sure she wanted to say out loud. Quinn just smiled, tilting his head slightly. I'm talking about you, boss. You work too hard. His tone was playful, but there was something else beneath it, something firm. always pushing, always running yourself into the ground. He gave a slow shrug. And for what? Delisa shook her head, trying to clear the static creeping into her thoughts. I'm supposed to be here, she repeated, gripping the chair tighter. Quinn clicked his tongue. Says who? He let the question hang, his fingers tapping lightly on the desk. Tick, tick, tick. You ever wonder, he mused, his voice like silk, if maybe you don't have to be? Jaleesa's pulse pounded. He was messing with her. He had to be. She tore her gaze from his, looking around, looking for something real, something solid. But everything felt soft, like the walls weren't quite staying in place. Quinn exhaled, leaning forward again, resting his arms on the desk. Listen, he said, his voice quieter now, almost gentle. I got this. You don't have to work so hard. His smile was small, knowing. I'll take care of everything. Jaleesa's stomach twisted. A deep, instinctual part of her screamed not to trust him. But the way he said it, the way his voice curled around the words, it was so easy to believe, so easy to just let go. Let go. Just felt so much better. It is better. It's amazing. Heather almost excavated her own cargo under, deep, and fast. Her breath caught in her throat. She dragged the timeline backward, fingers shaking. But no matter how far back she went, she wasn't there. She never walked in. She never stood at the counter. The register was untouched. The security fee showed Quinn running the place alone, just like yesterday. Jaleesa pushed back from the desk, her chair scraping against the floor. No, this wasn't right. The clock on the wall hadn't moved. The hands were frozen at 7:42 a.m. A sharp knock on the office door made her jump. She gasped, spinning around. Quinn stood in the doorway, watching, his face calm, his smirk slight, but his eyes were sharp, knowing. Problem? Quinn asked, voice light. Too light. Jaleesa opened her mouth, but the words stuck. She glanced back at the screen. Still frozen, still empty. Where's the footage from Monday? She asked. Quinn stepped inside slowly, hands in his pockets. There is no Monday, he said, just today. Again. The lights overhead flickered. The screen blinked, then reset. The bakery floor reappeared, still empty. No Quinn, no customers, just silence. You see it now, don't you? He added, tone casual, but his eyes never left hers. You're catching on. Jaleesa backed away from the monitor, her breath shallow. This isn't real, she muttered. Something's wrong with the system. Quinn laughed, quiet, almost kind. No, Jaleesa, something's wrong with the day. He gestured toward the clock again, still frozen. You're stuck, he said simply. We all are. She stared at him, confusion twisting into fear. But I just came back from the hospital. Quinn tilted his head. Did you? He whispered. Are you sure? His smile faded. You should have never opened the clothes. A chill ran down her spine. The memory rushed back. Tori's blanket shifting. The voice through the monitor. The cold leaking from the walls. She had thought she'd imagined it, chalked it up to exhaustion, but it followed her here. Or maybe she never left. Jaleesa turned back to the security screen. It was black now. No footage, no bakery, just a faint ticking, not from the monitor, but from behind the walls. Her knees buckled slightly. Where's my family? She whispered. Quinn didn't answer. He was already gone. The office was empty. The door still open, but no footsteps, no sound. No Quinn. Jaleesa stood alone, the silence pressing in like fog. She stumbled into the hallway. Empty. Every room she passed looked untouched, no signs of life, not even a whisper. Her footsteps echoed wrong, delayed, like time itself was unsure of her presence. She ran to the front of the bakery. Lights on, chairs down, register closed. No one, nothing. Only her reflection in the glass. Eyes wide, face pale, and behind her, only empty space. The clock above the counter ticked once, then stopped. Jealous turned, but no one was there. No baby, no Travis, no Zoe, no Quinn, no customers, not even time. Just her, standing in a bakery that no longer belonged to any day. A slow breath left her lips, shaky and hollow. Somewhere, far off, a bell jingled, one that hadn't rung in years. She whispered, barely able to hear herself. Am I the only one left? But the room gave no answer, only the soft hum of nothing. And then silence.